You toss aside like a fire leaves. I got you found some better weeks. 4-5 minutes around the bend when the government agents around you again.
That was actually the idea of the guy who signed us, whose name's Imran. He's based in the UK. And it made perfect sense because, you know, the album cover was a photo originally taken for the New York Times in the 60s. There's a reference to the New York Times on the album. And also, you know, just that there's something nice about using this kind of classic, old school symbol of New York, you know, the physical New York Times, to announce the record. We'd already been, you know, having a little bit of fun with giving people the initials of the album, MVOTC, and a lot of our fans were guessing at different titles. So we kind of had to announce it somehow. So it was nice to do it in a kind of somewhat bizarre way. When people saw the MV, a lot of our fans who'd been following us for a long time, they'd known that we'd taken a trip to Martha's Vineyard to write some songs. So a lot of them assumed that MV must be Martha's Vineyard, which is smart. I hadn't even thought of it. So some people wrote something like Martha's Vineyard or the Cape, things like that. But it was fun to think of them. I came up with some of my own. I never posted them. I thought the best one that I thought of was my visions of Tom Cruise. Well, you know, he went to the same high school I did.
Oh, okay.
So I hope one day I meet him and we can discuss that, because he is my favorite actor. That idea of a song full of references, it can be, when it's done right, it can be the best thing in the world. And, you know, when I think of songs that I like that are full of references, or albums, or, you know, rap songs that I like, it's really like becomes a text that you can study, and it's exciting to see where everything comes from. And just throwing a bunch of shit together is not always interesting. But if you can use that as a tool to convey some sort of meaning, then it really does feel powerful. And I think on this album, we felt a little more in control of our songwriting, whether it was lyrics or, you know, the production or the arrangement. And I really think that we were able to kind of use our references a little more calmly and hopefully more wisely. Because when we started out, you know, we really wanted to make a bold statement, and it wasn't enough that we would, you know, just have musical references. We would make sure that that you could look at the title of the song and help you understand where everything was coming from. Now I think we can do it in a slightly more laid-back way. Well, you just have to have a sense of humor, I guess, because some people think it's pretentious to be educated, or it's pretentious to be interested in things. You know, it's a very limiting idea, but some people think that, oh, if you like to read about history, you're pretentious. If you're interested in other languages, you're pretentious. Whereas the truth is, pretentious is a state of mind. It's the way you present something. You can be educated and pretentious. You can be uneducated and pretentious. And it also, to me, pretension involves a degree of self-seriousness. And if you can always have a little bit of a sense of humor about everything, I think that'll help you to make sure that your music and your ideas are not for any one type of person. So, you know, sometimes, you know, when on our first album, we had a song called Oxford Comma. I didn't know what an Oxford comma was my entire life, but when I first heard the phrase, there was something I immediately liked about the phrase. And I don't think a lot of our fans knew what an Oxford comma was before that song. Of course, some of them did. Some of our highbrow, you know, grammar professor fans did, but a lot of people didn't, and it didn't stop them from enjoying it. And I think in art needs to have those levels. So if every once in a while somebody will decode a song and they'll basically know exactly what I meant, and I'll read it and I'll be kind of shocked, and it's amazing. But even if that didn't happen, that's all right too, because there's some of my favorite songs I'm still decoding in my brain. You know, whether it's like some Leonard Cohen song, or I don't know, you know, Wu-Tang or something. I still think about these lyrics, and I find new ideas as I get older. So, you know, it's good to have levels. And if you've ever come to one of our shows, it's usually pretty fun. People have a good time. And then if you read some of the most intense criticism, you'd imagine that at our show, it's like very serious people, or something that you know, it's like overly intellectual or something, but it's really not the case. I mean, Even if you go on YouTube, it's amazing how many videos you can find of like 2-year-olds dancing to some of our songs. So there's no secret knowledge required to understand anything. And, you know, if people don't want to give us any credit for being playful, that's okay. But the truth is, we love to fuck around. Well, it's complicated. I mean, I always liked that phrase. And on the most basic, stupid level, it just sounded like a Vampire Weekend album title. Modern Vampires of the City. Like, it almost just seems like a description of the album. And then, you know, of course, to me, the vampire is a metaphor and is interesting. Much more interesting than literal vampires. We've never cared about literal vampires. Dracula and whoever. So that was exciting. But it was, the name kind of came before the album. That happened a little bit with Contra too. We had this name, it sounded like could be an album. But then we didn't know, you never know if it's going to fit. But then nobody could agree that should be the title in the beginning. So we, you know, just worked on the album, kept it in the back of our minds, started recording songs, starts to seem a little better. You know, Rustam finds the album cover, this image, the kind of mystical, hazy image of New York from a kind of unusual angle, not the typical angle you see the skyline from. And again, you see that cover, the title starts to sound a little better. And then even like little things like choosing a font. How should we write the album title? We figure out how to write it, and suddenly it starts to sound even better. And then by the end of it, you make the whole album, and then you make the final decision. Is this album called Modern Vampires of the City? And yes, and there's something nice about how you think it could be an idea, but you still have to prove it to yourself. And then by the end, when you have the title, the font, the cover, the songs, the lyrics, the production, the ideas, does it all work together? And then we started to feel really strongly that yes, it did. I understand why people are sensitive about the concept of cultural exchange or cultural borrowing, because you know, you don't have to be a PhD in sociology or history to know that there's a lot of racism associated with and you know, terrible things that are associated with certain types of cultural interactions, especially ones that kind of cross certain racial lines or economic lines. But when you're talking about art, you always have to remember that all art is a bit of a back and forth. So, you know, part of the reason why I was always interested in reggae lyrics is because my dad is a massive reggae fan, and he's also a Jewish guy from the Bronx. So from a very early age, he was always very interested to point out to me the connections between Rastafarianism and Judaism. And I remember, you know, probably being 12 or 13 years old and listening to the Harder They Come soundtrack with my dad, and you know, listening to the Rivers of Babylon. And I had no idea at the time. I liked the song. I liked the song. I didn't know the connection. He's basically like, you know, that this is from the Old Testament of the Bible. And I'd be like, oh, okay. I didn't know what Babylon meant. I didn't know what the story meant. But it kind of planted a seed in me that is interested in these connections. It doesn't mean that the experience of Jamaican people is the same as the ancient Israelites or something. It doesn't mean that the experience of the ancient Israelites is the same as anybody today. But it does show a certain fluidity of concepts, and the power of concepts to kind of cross different lines and take on new meanings. So, of course, it's important for an artist to keep in mind, you know, it's important for an artist to have a respect and humility when they're taking inspiration from other people's work, whether that person is white or black or Jewish or atheist or Christian. You know, it's important to have this respect and humility, but to shut yourself off would imply a kind of, I think, a misunderstanding of the history of art and the history of music. So, you know, I think I certainly understand the role of criticism in watching out for these types of things, but it can be misguided at times. But basically our music is built on seeing connections between things. So it's kind of natural that we're always going to find these connections. And it's not always about crossing racial lines. Sometimes it's about, seeing the connections between American music and Irish music or something. Maybe some people think that is a racial line. I don't know. But that is what we find exciting. And sometimes in the music we try to think out loud and even do our own kind of commentary about it, because we recognize that it's not always so simple. In the 50s and 60s, people have memories of people using race as a way to rip people off. Literally, not pay somebody for their song. Literally pretend that a song was traditional when it was written by somebody, and those are outrageous crimes. So I understand why people are sensitive about the history of race and pop music. Of course, who couldn't like that message, that no matter your nationality or ethnicity, there's a unity of humanity? A lot of people actually might not like that message, but I don't like those people. We don't have any trick. Every band is like a family, and every family has fights and disagreements and goes through changes. We would never try to give the impression that our band's always been very simple, but we knew each other for years before the band, so sometimes we have to have difficult conversations. Sometimes we very, very much disagree about things, but in the end, we always usually end up in a strong place. And of course, just like in a family, sometimes you have to have intense conversations, clear the air about things. But so far, so good on that front. And in terms of our output, we've only gotten more excited about it. So, I could imagine that if we were feeling creatively bored, it'd probably be pretty bad for our relationships too. But when in a band is all about collaboration. And when you achieve something and that you could not have done it by yourself, and that it's a collective effort, you can't help but kind of feel good, like you're all on the same team. Every time you finish an album and you feel good about it, that only strengthens that team sense. Yeah, you have to decide what makes sense for you. And the truth is, we wouldn't let any company use our music. It depends, and we judge it on an individual basis. But one thing that everybody needs to remember is whether or not you allow a company to use your song in their ad, your music is selling ads for companies. You could say no to everything. The websites that write about your song, even sometimes the websites that criticize you for selling your ads, they're using your content and your music to sell advertisements. That's the business model. And you go play a festival, it's all sorts of corporate sponsors and stuff. So sometimes I feel like the music industry is so inherently tied up with selling advertisement that there's actually something a little purer when a company comes to you directly. It's kind of like cutting out the middleman and just being straight up, we want to associate ourselves with your song. What do you say? And a lot of times we feel like our song's already associated with us, like, go for it. And everyone, like, when the first time we ever got like a big offer for a song was, they asked us, are you willing to let your song be used in this Will Ferrell movie called Step Brothers? And we all thought Will Ferrell was okay, and we thought he's pretty funny. And we said, maybe, but our music, we have a sense of humor, but is our music comedy? Do we want to associate ourselves with this? This song is a single. What if people only think of it in terms of this movie? And then eventually we said yes, and it turned out to be such a weird, brilliant movie. It's now like such a kind of a cult classic for a lot of people in America. And I was so happy that we said yes to it. And it just kind of added another dimension to that song. Some people hear that song, they imagine the opening of this insane movie, Step Brothers. But ultimately, that's just one way that people have heard of it. So, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. If I thought that we had to pin our entire career to a corporation, I'd be very picky about it. I would insist that it needs to be Gucci or Veuve Clicquot or something, because I'd really want to be doing something very elegant. And I might not say yes if it was, Coca-Cola. But if it's just a song, I don't think you're really quite selling your entire soul,
You toss us out like a fire leaves. I got to find somebody.